Welcome, everybody. My name is Bob Truby, and I work with the Emerging Scholars Network. And we're very happy to have you join us for this Emerging Scholars Network conversation. We're going to be talking today uh, about a wonderful gentleman, George MacDonald, and a work of his. A number of years ago, a dear saint in the Lord gave me a copy of Oswald Chambers, My Utmost for His Highest, when I was a young person, actually, and it's traveled with me throughout my years. Uh, Likewise, my son discovered Charles Spurgeon's Morning and Evening during college and put it on his tablet to use for his devotions. Others have used various prayer books like the Book of Common Prayer to reflect on Scripture and to pray through the year. Today, we're going to learn about another book that's in this genre, written by an author better known for his works of fantasy and his influence on the likes of C.S. Lewis. Uh, we're going to be learning about George MacDonald and a work that he did called The Diary of an Old Soul. Before we do that, just a notice here, we are recording the conversation today. If you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, leave your mic muted and disable your video. If you continue to participate with either of those enabled after the recording begins, you allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of the conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes. I'll stop the recording for a moment to give you a chance to adjust our recording. And it's just a pleasure to introduce our guest today. Dr. Timothy Larsen is joining us today. He has his doctorate from the University of Stirling, as well as a Doctor of Divinity from the University of Edinburgh. He is the McManus Professor of Christian Thought at Wheaton College. His many books include George MacDonald in the Age of Miracles, Crisis of Doubt, Honest Faith in 19th Century England, Every Leaf, Line, and Letter, which is also published with InterVarsity Press, and the Oxford Handbook of Christmas. With that, I will just welcome you, Dr. Larsen. Thank you so much for joining us today for this interview.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I wonder if you might start by, many of us are familiar with the different works of George MacDonald. Particularly, many of us have read his fantasies or fairy tales, but we know little of his life. And I wonder if you might briefly sketch his biography and the time in which he lived and wrote.
Sure. He is Victorian, so 19th century Britain. He is raised in Scotland, fairly high up and remote. I think I joke in the book on George MacDonald, and it's not quite a joke, it's more just kind of an observation that he could choose any church he wanted, but they were all Calvinists. So he's from a very Presbyterian orientated Calvinist Reformed Protestant world. Even though there are different denominations, there tend to be variations on the same theme. And he is a Congregationalist and trains for the ministry. I think decides that was a mistake. His real longing is to be a poet. But of course, there aren't entry-level positions for poets that have salaries. He's also married and has children. He ends up having 11 children. So he kind of finds his way forward over time on how to be a full-time writer. Ends up leaving the ministry, and he will continue to preach for free. And he also writes these amazing unspoken sermons, or collections of sermons that are really kind of sermon essays. So he's very committed to ministry in his own way, but he doesn't want it to be his vocation or how he gains his income. He becomes a full-time writer. He really pays the bills by writing what are called realist novels, so novels that don't include magical elements. But he loves fantasy. He's a pioneering fantasy author. He loves fairy tales. He writes great fairy tales. So those become more what he is famous for because they're more pioneering. But he writes an awful lot of realist novels that pay the bills. And so he has this mix of many different kinds of genres: poetry, sermons, novels, fairy tales, and so on, and lives out his life as a full-time author.
Hmm. You his fantasies and so forth. Uh, I gather he had quite a significant influence on other writers that we care about in the Christian community.
Yes, and there are two distinct lines there. One is children's literature. We can talk more about that. So children's literature wasn't very much of a thing
Hmm.
until the second half of the 19th century, and MacDonald is a key pioneer for that, along with his good friend who went by the pseudonym of Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
They're pioneering children's literature, but he's also an absolutely fountainhead pioneer of fantasy literature. And I think that's more what you're getting at. It just blew C.S. Lewis's mind, even when he was not a Christian, but he read Phantastes, this very strange fantasy novel that MacDonald wrote. And he says it baptized his imagination. It was just like a
Hmm.
whole new world, but also he could tell in retrospect as a Christian that it had the fragrance of Christ to it, even though it wasn't explicitly about Christianity. And so J.R.R. Tolkien, I think G.K. Chesterton, who loved George MacDonald, all the way down like Madeline L'Engle, and then of course many other authors are influenced by those authors, who therefore he becomes kind of the grandparent in that genealogy. Who
Hmm.
they were influenced by Tolkien, but Tolkien wouldn't have written what he wrote if he hadn't been influenced by MacDonald. So what made fantasy so distinct was it wasn't an allegory. It wasn't just mapping on, here's something you know from your world, and there's a kind of 1-to-1 ratio between this other thing and that thing. Here's another world that has its own logic and integrity that you just have to enter into. And that was unbelievably new for people at the time of MacDonald. And if you read Lilith and Phantastes, they're still deeply strange books. He got himself into another place that people had never been to before, or rarely been to before.
Perhaps one of these days you'll do an annotated version of that for some of us who puzzled over much of those works.
Yes, and the puzzling, I think, is part of the point.
I
He doesn't want you to be orientated. He wants you to be disorientated.
I know I spent a great quarter at Ohio State with a group of faculty just trying to work our way through Till We Have Faces from
Mm-hmm.
C.S. Lewis, which is
Yes.
a similar kind of work, I think, in many ways. And it took all of us to even begin to have a sense of what that work's about. But it was great doing together. Well, we're talking now about a different kind of work, a work of devotion. And I want and you write in the introduction to this edition just the important place works of devotion played in the Christian community of MacDonald's time. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about that and how people use these works.
Yes. So I did a book once called "A People of One Book: The Bible and the Victorians," which was about people's reading of Scripture. And what I kept hitting against, which was almost like I couldn't really believe it was true, was how many people from like across the denominations, not just evangelicals by a long way, would do devotions 4 times a day.
Hmm.
They would do a private one in the morning, and then they would do a family one in the morning, and then they would do it again in the evening. They would do a family one in the evening, and then a private one in the evening.
Wow.
And then again, I was kind of like, this can't really be true, but it was true. Um, and if you're doing devotions 4 times a day, you need some way to structure that. What does that mean? What am I doing with this time? And so there was a huge desire for aids to devotion, and both private devotion and family devotions, or household devotions, it was sometimes called, because servants would be involved, etc. Maybe guests, house guests. You read a lot of stories about this. And often a devotion would work pretty well either way, whether you were using it just totally privately or with this gathered circle in the family kind of parlor. And so McDonald's Diary of an Old Soul is participating in that very strong desire to, can I have some kind of aid to how to structure my devotional time that is daily?
Yeah, yeah. What's amazing too is how much reading aloud took place in this setting, the setting of the family.
Absolutely. It is astonishing. One of the people in the book that I did was Elizabeth Fry, the Quaker prison reformer. And she would just refer to Bible reading as reading. If she talked about any other kind of reading, she would
Hmm.
distinguish it. She would say like light reading or something. But if she just said reading, she meant the Bible.
Yeah.
Um, and her own Bible is annotated for what passages are appropriate for reading aloud in different circumstances. So she
Hmm.
would write in the margin, "Good for a time of sorrow," or whatever it was that to say, here's a passage to pick to read out loud to the people here because of the fittingness of this moment. And her she led devotions every day, and they were famous for gathering crowds. So although it's ostensibly household devotions, it would be like she'd be in a hotel and like 3/4 of the hotel guests would want to come and hear her read scripture in the morning, and so she's
Hmm.
having kind of like gathering a congregation almost for these daily devotions.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. Um, well, what occasioned the writing of this work, which is, you mentioned he has written some other poetry, but this is very different from the fantasies or children's stories or sermons that he published.
Absolutely. Um, I think he wrote it deliberately as a gift to his friends and loved ones. So he's first of all doing it himself just as a spiritual discipline. He wants to um, think about every day in a way that is drawing him closer to God. That's
Hmm.
really what each poem is doing. He wrote a poem every single day, and it's his attempt to say, how can I meet God in this day? What is God um, desiring of me, requiring of me? What am I trying to become? What am I trying to process or respond to? And then he's writing them down. So first of all, as a spiritual discipline for himself, and then as a gift for other people that he, particularly those people who are in his own social circle that he loves, to go through this process as well, to have a prompt for their daily devotions. And of course, he published it privately, I think, again, as just a gift kind of for his friends. But it was so beloved that it quickly got a regular publisher and became a classic.
Huh.
But that's how the origin of it.
Well, and the layout of the book, which InterVarsity Press has kind of followed in some ways, was kind of unique.
Yes, he had a page with the poems, and then the facing page is blank. And that's a costly choice in publishing. To give up all those pages is a way of making the book cost more to produce. Uh, and MacDonald is paying out of his pocket. He's not doing this book as a business adventure. He's doing it as a gift. So he's paying more. And the point is that the blank page is your encounter today with God. So you're reading this poem, which is a prompt, which is helping you think some things, nudge you in certain ways. But then on the blank page, it's now, okay, here is me and the trouble and anxiety that I'm carrying, or the hopes and aspirations and longings that I have, and I'm bringing them before God today.
Hmm.
And so it's a dialogue book. It's not just listening to George MacDonald. It is listening to God and then responding with your own prayers, with your own hopes.
Yeah, that is a wonderful feature, and the InterVarsity Press version actually follows that format. Uh, you typically will have 2 or 3 days on one side with a blank page on the other, uh, so that the book actually allows room for us to do what MacDonald hoped his first readers would do. Um, well, the title of the book originally was A Book of Strife in the Form of a Diary of an Old Soul. And I wonder if you might comment a little bit on several words in that title: strife, diary, and old soul.
Yes. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So the strife is really the battle of life. What are the things that are wearing us down, that are making us weary, that are assaulting us, that are challenging us? So he's going to come every day before God, and some of that is very practical. In this diary, you can tell that again, I'm inferring some things, but I think I'm right. That he, because he was a full time writer, he didn't have a salary. His income was very uncertain, and I think that they are forced to leave their family home during this year because he doesn't have enough money to pay the rent or to keep up whatever it is. He needs to sell the house to have to pay other bills. And so you have these poems which are about just that loss. You have him in times of ill health. So the strife is okay, life is a battle. It brings things that demand our fortitude, that are challenging us. How can I bring those before God and respond in a way that honors God? The diary part is every single day. It is the cycle of the year. And that's become more and more important to me as I've grown older. I actually got from my wife last Christmas a 5-year nature diary where you can write down the things that you
Mm,
see happening outside. And we're keeping this now. This is our first year doing it, but the first time that we see the robins come back, or that it snows, or that certain flowers come up, or a hawk lands in the yard, or whatever it is. And it's a way of like knowing where you are in time.
mm,
That there's you are a part of this process, and to see that process feels spiritually attentive and important. And then finally, old soul, I think, is kind of a joke. Um, so old soul literally means a person who's kind of wise beyond their years. So it's a flattering term that you would give to somebody. But McDonald, why it's a joke? Because McDonald's is like, the truth is I just feel old. It's not about beyond my years. It's just old. And so you see him wrestling a lot with aging, the aging process, the change
mhm.
that aging brings along in these poems. And so he's trying to bring wisdom to aging, is kind of like the double entendre of Old Soul.
Yeah. Yeah, I was impressed in the reading with how often he addresses his own weariness or dullness of soul, uh, uh, and how his longing to answer in his own heart the greatness of God's love and care for him, with his own love and passion and holiness. And
Yeah, I don't think we talk about that enough as Christians.
yeah,
Yeah, it does strike me as well in reading the poems that like you have to rally yourself sometimes to face the day. Here is a day that I haven't chosen, that includes things I don't want to do, or that includes things that I've been doing every single day for too long now. And how do I face that? And he is summoning up a kind of spiritual renewal in order
mhm,
to go at the day in a way that pleases God.
yeah. One of the things you observed in your introduction was that you described him as a prophet of holiness, and that might be an unsettling thing for
It
some
is.
who encounter these poems. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. McDonald really, really does want to just be somebody who is completely holy. McDonald has his annoying quirks and faults and distinctives that I don't always go along with. But I will say, as a historian, he really was committed to holiness. And that is a scary thing because what it means is it's the pearl of great price. It's the thing that you're willing to sacrifice other things for. And he is quite unflinching about that. His
Hmm.
goal is not to stop having pain, to get well, to get out of bed, to be able to go back to work. His goal is for God to sanctify him. And if God's way of sanctifying him is to leave him in pain and in his bed, then he's like, thy will be done. It's a pretty
Hmm.
bracing way to think about what matters in life.
Yeah. I found that to be the case in reading these, and but was just struck with his unflinching passion to become more Christ-like in his own life. Um, what has been your own experience of these poems, using them devotionally as well as in kind of immersing yourself in them for this publication?
Yes. So if I can kind of like do a big backstory, um, I'm a charismatic, and I was spiritually formed in a very extemporaneous, spontaneous way of going about
Mm,
prayer and the spiritual life,
yeah.
which has great strengths, and I'm still part of that tradition, and I do not renounce it at all. I'm so grateful for it. But what I've learned, so I'm parallel to this, I'm working on a book about military chaplains in the First World War, and a lot of them wrote um, similar kind of books of prayer books, books of structured prayer. And so I've been praying through them as a way of kind of as a kind of participant, observer, historian to get closer to them. And so both doing that and George MacDonald coming from a charismatic background,
Hmm.
what I've learned is that the weakness of the extemporaneous way of going about spirituality is that you only pray about things that you're already thinking about. And what prayer books do for you is they nudge you to think about things that you should be thinking about that you're not thinking about. So it's not just a felt need; it's the need that you need to acquire, or the feeling that you need to acquire that this is needed, even though you don't already have it. And so I found it very helpful and profitable in the mix to allow a wise Christian to say, here's something that you're not thinking about, but you ought to be thinking about. Here's something that you're not praying about, but you ought to be praying about.
Hmm.
And to accept that guidance as a way towards spiritual maturity and balance and discipline.
I found as well sometimes that in reading, he found words for things that you sense, but always don't always have words for,
Yes,
and which is an experience I've had with the Psalms as well. That
absolutely.
um, that that one of the things about these prayers is often they give us words to express what's kind of inchoate in our own lives that we'd love to get out, and he provides us words to express those things. What suggestions would you have for others who use this work devotionally?
Yes. So I say a few things in the introduction that I'll kind of reiterate here. One, they're all poems. So just to be clear, he's written a short daily poem for every day of the year, and poetry is a hit and miss kind of thing for individuals.
Hmm.
That's just the way poetry works, and that's part of the delight of poetry is to find a poem that just says what you want to say in a way that you get. So the kind of the triumph is the find, and therefore the opposite of that, which is equally true, is that lots of poems just maybe won't strike you. You want, I don't know, that doesn't like say what I want to say, or I'm not quite sure what it's saying, or I'm not sure I agree with what it's saying, and that's totally fine. So I think the wrong way to go about it is to expect too much of it, as if every
Mm.
single poem is going to be deeply meaningful and transformative for you, or that proves that you're not spiritual or something that you're, no, just accept that some will hit you more than others and enjoy the ones that you that really do. I'm a big marker of books, so I think mark the ones that really strike you. I do the same thing with the Psalms, as you're talking about earlier. It's like here is a psalm that really hit me, and I'll just kind of circle the chapter title and star it. And like if I'm in like in a point in my life where I need to go to a greatest hit, I'm like I'm gonna read a psalm that I starred because I need something that's gonna speak to me in a way that kind of connects with my situation. And so I do that. I did that with McDonald as well, and I like that. So that would be at least
Mm.
one strategy that I have for approaching it.
Well, it strikes me too that I find with great books, different things hit me at different seasons of my life.
Yes,
Uh, that a poem that didn't that just it left me flat at one point might really speak to me at another. Uh, and similarly with the Psalms or other
yeah.
literature.
All of Scripture. Yeah, that's Scripture is inexhaustible, and so we come back at it, and the world's in a different place, we're in a different place,
Yep.
and things hit us differently. But that's what we mean by a classic in literature, is that it is capable of being revisited because it hasn't been exhausted.
Hmm.
And so, to the extent that a work of literature is a classic, we find that we can revisit it at different times in our lives and suddenly see different things, or things land in different ways.
Hmm. I wondered if you had a favorite that you might read for us, if you have the book handy.
Wow. I, I do have favorites. But let me jump up a second. I'm picking pretty randomly, um, but I will read one. This is August 7th. In holy things may be unholy greed. Thou give us a glimpse of many a lovely thing, not to be stored for use in any mind, but only for the present spiritual need. The holiest bread, if hoarded, soon will breed. The manim moth, the having pride I find. 'Tis momentarily thy heart gives out heart quickening.
Hmm.
So what I'm hearing in that is, um, something can be really right and true and special for you spiritually, but you can try to make too much of it, to orientate around it, to settle there when it's not meant to be to settle there. You think of like uh, the Israelites with the bronze and serpent. You know, it was right for the moment, but they tried to like hold on to it as if it was all there was, and it became wrong. So I found that a lovely kind of spiritually wise insight.
Hmm.
St. Patrick talks about how when he was a slave in Ireland, he would get up at like 4 in the morning and go out in the snow and kneel down and pray, and how God met with him in powerful ways. But he's like very honest, like, I don't do that now. I don't think I could do it now, or I even want to do it now. But at the time, it was what I needed, and God met me that way. And I love that because it was a kind of honoring of both the moment and not making the moment into something that has to become permanent, that you're trying to get diminishing returns out of when that's not what God wants.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, it's time for us to let people know how they can get a copy of the book. I hope hearing a little bit of it has maybe enticed some to say, I really would love to get one of these. Uh, so just we'll share screen, and there's some information in the chat about ordering the book. The book we're talking about today is Diary of an Old Soul, and it may be purchased at the web address that's in your chat for 25% off with free shipping if you use the code IVPESN. And it gets better. That discount is good through July 16th. And you can actually use the discount on the whole order you place at InterVarsity Press on that occasion. So you can order some other books as well. So stop by InterVarsity Press, use the discount code IVPESN, and pick up your own copy, or maybe even think about this as a nice gift that you could do some Christmas shopping early this year for gifts for friends. Okay, with that, I'd like to just invite others in the audience. We'd love to hear your questions. You've been gracious in listening to Timothy and me talk for a while. I wonder if you'd share. We'd love to hear some of your questions, and just jot those in the chat, and we'll jump into them.
Well, one thing I'll make clear while we're waiting is that every poem is just 7 lines long. And so it's a very manageable thing to say, I'm going to read a poem a day. It's not like some kind of epic poem that you're kind of getting yourself into.
This is not a Psalm 119 type poem.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, Jeff has a question here. Let me get to that. Okay, Jeff asks, in addition to this text, where should I begin my re-exploration of George MacDonald? I tried and tried and tired of the fantasy books when I was in college. So how do we help
Yes.
Jeff get into some George MacDonald?
Um, the fantasy books are difficult and strange. So they are diving in the deep end to very cold water. Um, and it depends on what you want. But maybe the most accessible are the fairy tale short stories. The Light Princess is just a zany, fantastic short story. And of course, with a short story, you're not overcommitting to to either I'm going to read a full novel that I don't understand and don't like, or I'm going to give up, which feels like a failing.
Yeah.
You can get through 20 pages. McDonald in my own, I have another book coming out called 12 Classic Christmas Stories. And I think that McDonald wrote one of the greatest Christmas stories ever written, even though people do not talk about it. Um, it's called The Gifts of the Child Christ. Uh,
Yes,
you know that one?
I
I,
do. I bought that years ago in the old Erdman's two-volume edition.
yeah, exactly. That became the title of an anthology because it's the first story that it has. Um, so why is it not so well known? I think for two reasons. One, because it's more Christian than I think a lot of anthologies want to be. They want to keep it just about the cultural aspect of the holiday, and then there is sadness in the story, which I think some people like their Christmas stories to be super sentimental, sweet and light, and he allows sadness to become a part of it. But it's a beautiful, profound, surprising story, a great piece of literature.
Yeah, that's a wonderful collection of stories. Do you know if it's even in print these days?
I doubt that exact Erdman's copy is still in print, but I suspect you'll find a reprint publisher of some kind that will have it. Um, but again, my anthology is coming out in September and we'll have it in it. So
All right,
12,
all right. We
12
will look.
classic Christmas stories. Um, and that was a lot of fun to do. It also has G.K. Chesterton. He did a story called The Shop of Ghosts. It was a Christmas story, which is good fun. But it has Charles Dickens and Louise May Alcott and Conan Doyle and Willa Cather and a whole range of classic authors. So that was a fun project to do as well. I was doing them together, this Diary of an Old Soul and that, and I had a lot of fun kind of learning the art of annotating. How can you make clear to a reader what is going on in something that's culturally obscure because it was a different time or a different way of speaking? So I had fun trying to figure out where to put in some footnotes to make sense of things that are confusing now today.
Hmm, yes. Um, well, JP says, thank you so much for your talk. George MacDonald clearly moved away from a more reformed Calvinist way of thinking, and he also embraced a form of holiness theology in keeping with the oldest Catholic traditions. Do you know why MacDonald never became Roman Catholic or even Eastern Orthodox?
Yeah, um, so it's a lovely question. He is raised in a very, very Protestant world. So people have asked the same thing about C.S. Lewis, who is very attracted to some Catholic aspects of the faith. He actually goes to a monk to do sacramental confession, a surprising part of C.S.
Hmm.
Lewis's life. But he was also raised in Ulster Irish, Northern Irish Protestantism, and so Catholicism and Orthodoxy are a long way away. Um, so MacDonald ended up in the Church of England, and that seemed to provide the via media, as the Church of England boasts of itself, that included some of these other traditions, but wasn't as far as going to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. And I also I'll just um, respond to the first part of the question, which doesn't necessarily contrast it with Catholicism, but it is important to see. MacDonald only rejected certain select parts of certain kinds of Calvinism or Reformed theology. And the part that he kept in particular is meticulous providence. That everything that happens because it is God's will, because it is the best thing that can happen. Which, again, we talked about this earlier, is a very unflinching way to approach life circumstances.
Hmm.
And it continually surprises me how MacDonald approached life that way. He would write to his wife, when she was ill, I can't, say that I'm not unhappy because I know God is doing something in your life. That kind of not very sympathetic response to your wife being ill, but he talked to himself that way when he was ill. So it was, at least he was like consistent. And so he's getting rid of parts of Reformed teaching or certain forms of Reformed teaching, but he's keeping others in ways that are quite dramatic.
Yes, yes. One of the other, and JP says thanks for that. Jeff actually posted a link to a George MacDonald website that has, I think, an e-version of the Gifts of the Child Christ. So at least that version is available on one of the George MacDonald websites. One of the other questions that I wanted to ask you about is, and I don't know that it necessarily comes through in these poems, but I've heard MacDonald referenced as one of those who, was more supportive of a universalist stance in terms of salvation. And I wonder if you've looked at that
Yeah,
much or would have any
yeah,
comments on that.
yeah, absolutely. I personally do not think it's accurate to describe him as universalist, but I understand why people do. So he's definitely on a spectrum, and he's farther down that spectrum. The Victorians made a big distinction between what you can hope for and what you can teach, and I think that distinction often gets conflated in the discussion today.
Hmm.
So MacDonald, I don't believe, taught and believed that you could teach that God is going to save everyone, but he was willing to hope for that,
Hmm.
and he also has, which is in contrast to kind of standard um, Protestant Orthodox teaching, if I can put it that way, um, a sense that your fate is not set irrevocably at death.
Hmm.
So he has a notion of a kind of purgatory. Um, and again, I take that as a loaded word, and I understand that, but you are still interacting with the living God after your death, and you are either responding to His will or rejecting His will. And so MacDonald believes that you can give up your resistance
Hmm.
even after you are dead, um, and therefore, what was hell becomes purgatory for you because you have given up your resistance.
It's interesting that the character, the narrator character in The Great Divorce, the person he encounters is George MacDonald.
Yes, and yeah, and Lewis's view of hell is deeply influenced by MacDonald.
Hmm.
And again, other thing I want to say about that, I think people hear today universalism and they hear a very kind of sentimental, fluffy, sin doesn't matter, judgment isn't true because God is loving, the kind of thing. MacDonald is unbelievably unflinching in God's willingness to inflict pain on you in order to benefit your soul, and so
Mhm.
he has a very painful hell that's very real, and God is not going to let you out until you've paid the last farthing. He takes that parable, which hardly ever gets preached, at least that line of it, as a very literal truth that God demands of you that you give up all of your sin And if that means inflicting pain on you indefinitely until you can see that God cares about your holiness more than your happiness, and that's the deal he's going to make. His only difference from the way some Protestants think about that is he concedes that that might not be irrevocably eternal, but that a change can be made in the afterlife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things I probably should mention is in terms of our own organizational stance is not a universalist stance. We our our doctrinal basis does actually really talk about both about everlasting salvation and everlasting condemnation, and which I think is probably I don't think we have any statements that really allow us necessarily to believe otherwise. Um, uh, and as much as we might hope otherwise, which it appears, which it seems to be the line that MacDonald walked.
Yes. Yeah, to me, how I think about this is what's interesting about the scriptures and the Christian tradition is that no individual is named as going to hell.
Mm-hmm.
When I say this, people often say the rich man and Lazarus, and I say, one, that was a parable, I think, but even if it's literally true, it's not. Lazarus has a name, but the rich man doesn't. He's a category. So what that tells me is that we never have the authority ourselves to say this particular individual has gone to hell. But we can't vacate the scriptural warnings about the reality of hell. So
Yeah.
we proclaim something that says you should be warned that what you're doing is a way of death. But we are presumptuous if we say, I know this person went to hell.
Yeah. I can't know how God judges.
Yeah.
Uh, I can know the standard by which he judges in scripture. But how that applies to a particular individual, I have to leave to God. Yeah. Yeah. Well, any last questions that people want to jump in on? We have a couple minutes left before we need to wrap up here. And so I'd love to get any other questions that our audience has. Okay, here we go. Here's another,
Mm.
and it's kind of picking up on the conversation. Uh, okay, after reading MacDonald's essay Justice, I would have understood him as being stronger on universalism than a tepid universalism. No?
Yeah. Again, what does strong mean? What does tepid mean? I guess is my question.
Mm-hmm.
So he believes that there's possibility for a repentance to happen after death. And his suspicion is that you won't hold out as long as God holds out.
Hmm.
so so in that sense, he's optimistic that in the end you will submit to God's will. But that is a speculation. I think he sees it as a speculation. And you can hold out indefinitely and painfully. So yeah, does he have a hope that in the end everything is reconciled? I think he does have that hope. But that's different from that being part of the gospel, part of the proclamation, part of the teaching that we're authorized to give to humanity. And that distinction between speculation and teaching, I think, is what I'm trying to get at that I think people often miss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, one of the things we like to do in our conversations is to give our guests the last word, as it were. And I wonder if you have any final comments, encouragements, whatever, in terms of this work that you've worked on, Diary of an Old Soul.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful adventure to think about the state of your soul every day for a year. He's essentially kind of putting you on a year-long audit or inspection and journey.
Hmm.
And I think if the more that you're taking notes yourself to be able to look back and say, oh, I've forgotten like how discouraged I was in February. But looking back at the entire year, I see God's grace and God's faithfulness and things that have changed, things that I thought felt so um, impossible that have now turned around. I was so worried about this person in my family, and things are better now. So I think the invitation of MacDonald is to attend to the way that God is working in your life over time, and to have enough of a record of that to notice that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation today. This has been wonderful. One more time, we want to let people know about how to pick up the book that Timothy's been involved in. He actually writes an introduction to the book, which really sets this in its time, and also provides just, I thought, very helpful but not obtrusive annotations that help make sense of unusual words that MacDonald uses or allusions that he makes that might not be readily familiar. So anyhow, to get the book, once again, I'll just put up the screen. The book that we're talking about right now is Diary of an Old Soul, and you can purchase it at InterVarsity Press. One of the things that's even nice about the book is it has a ribbon that's part of it, so that you can even keep your place without a bookmark. This one doesn't fall out, and so you can pick this up. It's a great gift for somebody you care for, and the discount will be available until July 16th, and you can apply it to anything else that you order at InterVarsity Press as well. We do want to tell you about some of the next conversations that we have as well, and actually I'll put the screen back up for that. Our next conversation, I'm very excited about this one as well. It's going to be with Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac, who is a pastor in Bethlehem, and he is going to be writing, talking about his book, The Other Side of the Wall, which he says is an invitation for us to step into the other side of the wall and to listen to the story of to our stories and perspectives. It's my humble request that you allow me to share how Palestinians experience God, read the Bible, and have been touched and liberated by Jesus, a fellow Bethlehemite who has challenged us to see others as neighbors and love them as ourselves. This book paints a picture of our story of faith, lament, and hope, and I invite you to join and listen on our side of the wall. There's a link in the chat where you can sign up for that conversation, and I look forward to engaging. As you know, the Palestinians have been very much in the news, and among Palestinians who've been affected by the current conflict are a number of believing Christian Palestinians, as well as many others. And he gives that perspective on the conflict. And I think we should have a really interesting conversation of understanding that, and also of what the American church can do to really care for their brothers and sisters who are on the other side of the wall. So join us for that next conversation. Finally, we just want to mention that today's conversation is part of a series that has been hosted by the Emerging Scholars Network. And we invite anybody who's watching to join the Emerging Scholars Network at blog.emergingscholars.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or X, as it's now known, and visit and subscribe to our ESN YouTube channel, where this video and other videos, we have over 60 videos now on the YouTube channel, and you are welcome to pick those up. So with that, we want to thank all of you for joining us today. We're going to end our recording, and if you want to stick around for a few minutes and chat informally, you're welcome to do so.